Order, order. We now come to the debate on the treatment of adults with autism by the criminal justice system, and I call Kevin Brennan.
Thank you very much, Sir Edward, and it's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship as ever, and I'm very pleased to have secured the debate this afternoon on this crucial topic which affects the lives of many adults with autism and the families who support them. And the subject, as you quite rightly say, Sir Edward, is adults with autism and what happens when they come into contact with the criminal justice system. It's understandable in this place and elsewhere that a lot of focus is given to children with autism, and that's quite right, given the need for educational and other support for them and for their parents and for their families. But of course, autism does not cease to be an issue when someone turns 18 and becomes an adult, and when many of the services which might be available for children fall away when people with autism become adults. Parents get older, and it's often more difficult to cope with the situation. Adults with autism are faced with a complex world outside of full-time education, where behaviours and traits associated with autism are often poorly understood, misinterpreted, or even mistaken sometimes for criminality. And I'd like to say some more about that in due course in my remarks. I'd first of all, though, like to acknowledge the work of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Autism, which has been supported by the National Autistic Society and many other campaigners, which has resulted in recent positive developments in the criminal justice system in relation to adults with autism. And I'd like to congratulate the APPG for being successful in securing the support of the former prisons minister, who wrote to all prisons in England and Wales, encouraging them to undertake autism accreditation. That's the member for South West Bedfordshire, I think, was the former prisons minister. And he wrote to all of the prisons encouraging them to undertake autism accreditation. And it's a pleasing thing, Sir Edward, that one prison has already been accredited. And as I understand it from the APPG website, there are 7 more undergoing that process. But there's a long way to go. There's more than well over 100 prisons in England and Wales. So there's a long way to go in making further progress on that. And recent cases which are featured in the press, such as that of a young man called Marcus Potter, show that the use of the prison system can in fact exacerbate the condition of those with autism rather than actually act in the public interest and cause deep distress and problems. In this case, a young man who has had an autism diagnosis since the age of 3 has got into trouble for his compulsive filming of the local police. And in his case, the judge decided to release him, Sir Edward, from prison, opting for a care plan and a probation instead, and concluded, and these are the judge's words, the worst place for you is where you are at the moment. So there's a lot of work to be done in relation to the issue of adults with autism and prisons, and there may be honourable members here who want to say something about that during the course of the debate this afternoon. Of course, I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Just on that point, I've got the privilege of chairing the Westminster Autism Commission, and I don't know if you saw the recent report on the barriers to healthcare. And it's all these institutions, whether it's criminal justice, it's health, there has to be special consideration for people on the autism spectrum, because they are very hostile environments just because of the nature of that challenge.
Yes, and can I congratulate my honourable friend on the work he's doing on that commission and on the work he's done around health. And of course, one of the complexities about having a debate like this is which department should be answering a debate of this kind on autism. Sir Edward, I don't think I'm giving away any state secrets to say that, I received a phone call from the government saying, which department do you think should be replying to your debate? And I don't blame the government for that, by the way, because having been a government minister, I completely understand how government works. But one of the key problems is that difficulty in making sure that services are joined up across health, across the Justice Department, across the Attorney General's Department, across the Home Office, across the DWP, across the education system and so on. All of these play into each other. So even though today's debate is specifically about the criminal justice system, it's inevitable that these other issues play into the debate. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Does he think it might be worth government considering, perhaps with a Cabinet Office oversight, the way we have done with veterans, creating a Covenant of Veterans Board so that every department has someone absolutely focused on this issue, and the autism which affects every department and how we make forwards could actually drive this agenda much more comprehensively through the system?
Well, Sir Edward, I think that's an excellent suggestion. And in my experience in government, really, to get departments working together, you really do need to bring ministers together and not just officials in order to get progress. And ministers who understand and are committed and are passionately committed to make the change. And it is possible to make significant change simply by ensuring that ministers are brought together. And when I was a minister, I attempted a joint project with another minister, and the only way we could get it done, was by ensuring that we met regularly and we told our officials, you will do this, even though it's not within the culture of the department currently to do it. You will do it, and we're both telling you you'll do it, and you'll work together to do it. So I think her suggestion is an excellent one, and I hope the minister will take that on board, and perhaps even if he can't commit to doing that this afternoon, certainly commit to taking it away and discussing it with his colleagues. I will give way.
Honourable Bench, very generous. But isn't it the case that all the institutions are saying you actually have to have training for those people who are on the autism spectrum? I don't know if you noticed in the joint the debate last week, Alex Henry, an autistic young man, who was not involved in a case, but a boy that was with him stabbed someone. This young man is in prison for 19 years. He was an easily led young man on the autism spectrum. And people on the autism spectrum do tend to be quite easily led and are very impressionable. And, the criminal justice system should be sensitive to the needs of autistic people.
Again, I agree with my honourable friend, and I will come on to talk a little bit about the issue of making sure that there are joined-up understanding and that the criminal justice system needs to be able to identify and understand the vulnerabilities of people with autism when they come into contact with the criminal justice system. I was in the process of talking about a young man who had been sent to prison, and I pointed out there's a lot of work to be done on the issue of adults with autism and prisons. And I won't go on further about that today, but other honourable members may wish to speak to you, because I want to focus in my remarks on the earlier stages of the criminal justice system, and particularly issues around safeguarding and arrest. Now, people with autism can often exhibit behaviour that others categorise as unusual. Specific behaviours, such as stimming, a repetitive physical movement, which helps reinstate a sense of calm in a person with autism, is a particular trait to people with autism, and it's rarely understood by others. Indeed, most people I speak to, Sir Edward, have never even heard of stimming and don't know what it is. And as I said, behaviours that are seen to be unusual can sometimes be misinterpreted as antisocial, or even worse, as a criminal act. Indeed, it's been suggested that those who are the highest functioning on the autism spectrum can often bear the brunt of such misinterpretations, as their condition is not otherwise obviously visible, and so they aren't always extended the benefit of the doubt. And I hope that when the Minister responds this afternoon, that he'll outline what his views are and what's been done to try and prevent people with autism from being mistakenly criminalised by that misinterpretation of that particular trait. And what steps are being taken to ensure that the behaviour of those on the autistic spectrum is not misinterpreted by police and by the judiciary. Now, when adults on the autistic spectrum do come under suspicion of criminal behaviour, safeguarding at that point, Sir Edward, becomes crucial. And I want to refer to a case, the case of a constituent of mine, but one who wishes to remain anonymous for obvious reasons. And I just want to refer to the fact that the safeguards in the criminal justice system did not protect him as they should have under current policy and practice. Now, due to his understandable desire not to be named public, I won't go too far into the detailed circumstances which led to the arrest of my constituent on 2 different occasions. I know that ministers are aware of the details of the case through previous meetings and correspondence, but suffice to say that his stimming was misinterpreted whilst travelling in crowded conditions on public transport, and that's what led to his arrest. He declared his autism before he was arrested, which should have triggered a different pathway from a normal arrest. But he was not diverted or safeguarded at the point of contact as he should have been. On the first occasion, no appropriate adult was called, his parents were not contacted as they should have been, and he was not assessed as fit for interview. And there was a caution issued against him, which was later quashed due to these lapses in procedure. Unfortunately, he was arrested again 3 years later, and his vulnerability and protected characteristics were not properly recognised by the police or the health professional who assessed him. The reasonable adjustments, in other words, Sir Edward, that are required by law were not made during his detention or subsequently, and that case then was dropped without charge. Now, in January 2009, Lord Bradley, who, of course, is a former member of this House and who pays very close attention, Sir Edward, to these kinds of proceedings, he published his review of people with mental health problems or learning disabilities in the criminal justice system. And his report set out a policy of liaison and diversion for those with these kinds of issues away from police custody for assessment by clinicians prior to arrest and custody. Now, at this point, I want to be perfectly clear. Diversion doesn't mean not having to answer to the allegations, Sir Edward, but it does mean that behaviours associated with autism are properly contextualised, and both the accused and the evidence is properly protected, and that an appropriate adult is present, as I mentioned earlier. And Lord Bradley specified in his report, and I quote, "Studies into the use of appropriate adults have concluded that the provision of the appropriate adult is very inconsistent. Firstly, the needs of a defendant have to be identified, which are often missed. Even when a need for an appropriate adult is identified, there is currently a shortage of individuals who can perform the role effectively." Now, my contention is, Sir Edward, that if Lord Bradley's recommendations had been properly followed at the time my constituent was arrested in 2011 and 2014, it is certainly possible that the trauma he and his family have suffered could have been subsequently avoided. And my constituents are not the only ones who had such misunderstandings with the police. In fact, the National Autistic Society has said, and I quote, "Our charity still hears regularly from autistic people and families who say that responding police did not understand autism and did not respond appropriately." And this causes unnecessary distress to the individual and to the police attending. So, I will in one moment, yes. I will in 1 second. I'm going to ask him to sit down for 1 second while I finish my point. Okay. And that is, in driving home my point before he helps me, I'm going to say to the Minister, can we have an assurance from him at the end of the debate that he will go back and look at Lord Bradley's proposals and make sure that they are being fully implemented across the system? And I will now, with great pleasure, give way to my honourable friend.
It's such a good speech, but it's stimulating me to remind him of the court system. Actually, very often, it derides a professional opinion about the case, the facts of autism. And probably the best-known expert on autism in the country is Professor Baron Cohen at Cambridge University. And in 2 recent cases, Lowry Love who is in danger of being sent to the United States, where he will almost certainly be in danger of committing suicide. His evidence, the professor's evidence, was dismissed out of hand. In fact, attacked. He was attacked as an expert when he was in court. And that's happened in a number of cases where professionals who know about autism are disregarded. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think the phenomenon he describes is a very distressing one, and that he's absolutely right to describe Professor Baron Cohen as being one of the world's experts in this area, and it is obviously highly concerning that his evidence wouldn't be taken seriously in an instance such as he described. So I hope the Minister will give consideration to that and consider whether or not in future the government might think there's any legislation required in this area to make sure that the sorts of recommendations made by Lord Bradley are actually happening across the system. Now, the issues that I am raising today were borne out in a study from the University of Bath, Sir Edward, which published in 2016. And their survey of almost 400 police officers found that only 42% of officers, so a minority of officers, were satisfied with how they had worked with individuals on the autism spectrum. 37% of officers had received specific training on how to work with individuals on the autism spectrum, but many found that even that training was not tailored to their specific roles within the police force. And in addition, organisation and time constraints were cited as specific barriers. So I wonder, again, if the Minister, in his response, can tell us what assessment he's made of the effects of the continuing cuts to police budgets on the training that's offered to police officers and staff working with adults on the autistic spectrum. And what will he do following this debate to ensure that safeguarding policies are properly put into action across the board? Now, the National Autistic Society has a free resource aimed at police officers and staff, which offers a guide to working with people on the autistic spectrum. And I hope the Minister will be able to join with me in publicly encouraging police services in England and Wales to use this resource, and if appropriately in Scotland and Northern Ireland as well, but to use this resource and can seriously consider its guidance. As I said, in relation to my constituent, the allegations made against them resulted in a caution that was quashed, and those allegations in the second instance were dropped. But to his great distress, these erroneous allegations remain on the police databases. And at the time of his arrest, my constituent was living and working across the border in England, not in Cardiff. But the discovery that the allegations against him were kept on police databases, despite the police having acknowledged that they were inaccurate, caused him very severe psychiatric harm, as was confirmed by 2 separate psychiatric reports. And as a result, my constituent ended up giving up his job, his flat, and his independence to return home to live with his parents in Cardiff. Now, that cannot be an outcome that we want to see for an adult with autism who's established independence and a productive role in society, in the workplace. It shows the life-changing effects that the lack of safeguarding can actually end up having. The allegations remain on police records. The Chief Executive of the relevant NHS Trust invited both the police and the Independent Police Complaints Commission to send representatives to 2 meetings to discuss how they could help safeguard my constituent from further psychiatric harm, and I'm sad to say they didn't attend either meeting. And despite extensive and complex complaints being made to the relevant agencies, those made to the Police and Independent Police Complaints Commission remain unresolved, and my constituent and his family have grave concerns about the governance and compliance with required standards demonstrated in the handling of their complaints. Now, there's no evidence that the police service involved have recognised my constituent's continuing vulnerability or put in place plans to respond appropriately and safely in the event of further contact with him. And in my view, therefore, they've neglected to safeguard him from possible future risk of harm. And prior and subsequent to the first incident, he was studying for a degree and travelling daily on public transport. Prior to the second incident, he was working full-time, but however, his experiences, and in particular the failure to remove or amend the allegations, as was predicted by the senior medical consultants who assessed him, resulted in serious impairment of his health and development, with significant increase in his anxiety and impact on his functioning. And as I said, as a result, he lost his employment and moved back home and is no longer able to travel independently on public transport. So I think in pursuing his case, my constituent and his parents have unearthed many worrying inconsistencies. For example, he was told originally by the police that the case against him was not pursued on public interest grounds, whereas the Solicitor General later confirmed it had been dropped through a lack of evidence, two very different reasons not to prosecute. And honourable members will recall, Sir Edward, on the 30th of November, just last year, when we had a Commons debate on the autism community, mental health and suicide, reference was made to recent research findings that autistic people are 9 times more likely to kill themselves than the average population. For people on the autistic spectrum, contact with the criminal justice system can often come at moments of heightened anxiety. As such, it's crucial that all parties are fully informed and trained to find a solution that does not cause undue distress, or in the case of my constituent, severe psychiatric harm. So I urge the Minister to listen to today's debate, to listen to the suggestions from honourable members, to speak with his colleagues in government, and to seek to find a way to work in a more joined-up fashion in a ministerial-led initiative in order to make sure that what happened to my constituent doesn't happen to him again, and more importantly, doesn't happen to others, and to ensure that in this country we have a reputation across the world for having the highest standards in dealing with the issues faced by adults with autism.
The question is that this House has considered the treatment of adults with autism by the criminal justice system. John Lamont.
Thank you very much, Sir Edward. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank and congratulate the Honourable Member for Cardiff West for bringing this important issue to the attention of Parliament today. May I also take the opportunity to congratulate the UK Government and the National Autistic Society for their work in establishing the first autism-accredited prison in the whole world at Her Majesty's Young Offenders Institute at Feltham, which I understand some honourable members here today have had the opportunity to visit. I'm very proud that the United Kingdom is leading the world on this issue. Facilities like those at Feltham will be important in rehabilitating offenders, but more importantly, I hope it will ensure that young people with autism do not have to endure overly distressing sentences that will cause damage to their mental and perhaps even their physical health. I would welcome any moves by the Ministry of Justice and relevant devolved departments and governments to increase the number of autism-accredited prisons across the entirety of the United Kingdom. Given that prisoners are more likely to be autistic than the general population, it seems clear to me that we must do all we can to improve autism awareness and support in our prison estate. However, autistic people are more likely to be victims or witnesses of crimes rather than perpetrators. I welcome the National Autistic Society's guidelines to help professionals in these situations, and I hope they will continue to support the hard-working men and women in our police force, prison and court system. Honourable members may be aware, Sir Edward, that the Scottish Government has just finished a consultation on refreshing the Scottish Strategy for Autism. This will look to address issues across many areas of autism and will focus on, at least in part, on the criminal justice system. A freedom of information request highlighted, I have to say, by the great research team here in the House of Commons has shown that the National Autistic Society's opinion on how the Scottish criminal justice system looks after autistic people is far from satisfactory, saying that the Scottish criminal justice system is failing autistic people. And I look forward to reading the findings of this consultation, and I do hope the Scottish Government will act to ensure that this failure does not continue in the future. Absolutely.
thank the honourable member for giving way. Would he join with me in congratulating Police Scotland and indeed Jackton Police Training School in my constituency? I had the good fortune to visit them just on Friday of last week to hear that mental health training has been rolled out to all officers right across Police Scotland, including autism awareness.
Absolutely, and I think the member highlights a very important point, and certainly my discussions I've had with my local police force clearly demonstrates that there's a much greater understanding, not just by the police, but other emergency workers in terms of how they handle and deal with people with autism that they invariably come across during their work. Sir Edward, in Scotland there is estimated to be 58,000 people living with the autism spectrum condition. It is vital, therefore, that they receive fair and inclusive treatment by the criminal justice system, not only when they are suspected of a crime, but when they've perhaps witnessed or have been a victim of crime as well. People with autism have as much an equal part to play in a fair and just society as anyone else, and it's our job to ensure they are treated as such. Thank you.
Rimmer.
It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Sir Edward, and I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Cardiff West, on bringing this important debate forward today. Adults with autism experience the criminal justice system in a unique way, reflective of the unique and complex way they experience the world, with social, physical and psychological symptoms of their condition, all existing on a broad spectrum. Recent studies have shown that we are all exist somewhere on that spectrum. Adults with autism and their individual needs within the criminal justice system are often not immediately identified on their first contact with it, and this has significant consequences for autistic people, both as offenders and victims. The Autism Act 2009 was the first condition-specific legislation of its type in England, brought in, I'm proud to say, under a Labour government. And the coalition government's 2014 Think Autism strategy set out two key priorities relating to criminal justice as identified by those with autism themselves, as well as their carers. As phrased in the policy document, in their own words, I want the everyday services that I come into contact with to know how to make reasonable adjustments to include me and accept me as I am. I want the staff who work in them to be aware and accepting of autism. The second is, if I break the law, I want the criminal justice system to think about autism and to know how to work well with other services. I cannot emphasise enough that adults with autism are much more likely to be the victims of crime, 7 times more likely, than they are to be offenders. The National Autistic Society tells of horrific crimes perpetrated against adults with autism, including one autistic man who, aged just 21, was harassed, raped and murdered, in part because of his condition. His mother said that he was vulnerable and became a target because of his condition, but we weren't given any help. 49% of adults with autism in 2014 survey said they had been abused by someone they thought as a friend. Autism brings with it an inherent vulnerability to bullying and social exclusion, and we must urgently work to entrench awareness and respect for it within our society, starting in our schools. ONS statistics between 2013 and 16 showed that autistic people were 4 times more likely to experience disability hate crime than those with disabilities affecting their stamina, mobility or vision. In other words, there's no empathy for it. Will the Minister commit to looking at the rise in disability hate crime, which rose 53% between 2015-16 and 2016-17, and explore how we can tackle this national shame? Intrinsic in the condition, generally speaking, is a desire to keep to the letter of the law, very much so. But as in the community as a whole, some adults with autism do commit crime. It is widely accepted that in the case of autistic people, a significant proportion of crime committed is caused by circumstances that provoke discomfort, fear or misunderstanding, and they are easily had at times. The Right Honourable Member for Norfolk himself, the Minister for Care and Support at the time of the Think Autism Strategy publication, said in December last year that we should be investing more into keeping people with mental health conditions, learning disabilities and autism out of our prisons altogether, something I absolutely agree with. The National Autistic Society agrees with this assessment, stating that for many autistic people, prison has meant the system has already failed. Of course, this is not always possible, but will the Minister commit to exploring the equivalent of autism accreditation for the criminal justice system in its entirety, from the point of exposure to exit? This would mean looking at what reasonable adjustments could be made throughout the system, from the police being called to quick-fire questions at interview, to appearances in court, to detention in prison, and of course to rehabilitation. The most prevalent problem appears to be in policing, the first point of contact for most with criminal justice. A 2016 study showed that 7 out of 10 adults with autism were dissatisfied by their experience with the police, reporting discrimination, a lack of clarity and feeling that their needs were not met. The Think Autism strategy tasked the College of Policing with developing autism awareness training for new recruits. I welcome this move, but responding police must across the board be trained to understand that when they identify someone may potentially have autism, their approach must be to respect that person's needs. Wailing sirens, loud noises, being touched, being shouted at, these are all experiences which combined would lead to sensory overload for most adults with autism. In those circumstances, people with autism's behaviour, such as stimming, can be misinterpreted so easily as aggression. Uniform education of the police about autism is without doubt the key to preventing excessive distress and unnecessary violence. So I urge the Minister to take steps to ensure that all police, no matter how long the length of service, have the autism understanding that they need. People with autism may also be seen as unreliable witnesses, as the stress may alter their behaviour in a courtroom, and the often literal nature of their responses may not be conducive to effective self-advocacy or providing accounts of events that have happened to others. Since 1999, it has been legally possible for measures to be taken at the court's discretion to identify people as vulnerable and to adapt proceedings accordingly. But this is implemented, I understand, far less frequently than is reflective of the number of vulnerable people who pass through our courts. Yes, I will.
Shannon.
It's not just first of all, congratulate her on bringing that matter forward, but it's not just about the prison officers, it's about the court services, about the prison service. It's about recognising the issues early on in that process. If you do it early on, then you can address the issues further down the line. You can also put at minds at rest of those who have autism and who are clearly distressed by the activities that they're going through.
I accept the very points you're making, and if it happens right at the instance, right at the policing, it should be there and go right through the system with that individual. I welcome the recent progress which has allowed witnesses on the autism, as said that, to request a registered intermediary, to help judges and lawyers phrase their questions more appropriately. Will the Minister look at measures to enforce the universal implementation of these measures to make our courts more accessible to vulnerable people? Much more still could be done to educate legal experts about the complexities of autism to reduce the possibility of miscarriages of justice and avoid placing undue stress on autistic witnesses. Research about social attitudes shows jurors may also still hold stigmatised beliefs about autistic individuals, which could negatively impact their decision regarding that person at trial. Given that only 16% of autistic people and their families believe that the wider community understands the disability, it's likely that this could be a systematic issue in criminal justice. I also want to focus on the Think Autism objective around effective joint working. The Government's 2016 progress report on Think Autism, only 11% of local authorities gave themselves a green rating for their work with the criminal justice system in relation to autism. This was based on people with autism being included in development of local criminal justice diversion schemes, involvement in the Autism Partnership Board and evidence of joint working. I am deeply concerned about these figures. I understand, however, that the Government is reviewing the strategy next year, and I would be pleased to note any progress at that point. The APPG and Autism hosted a meeting on criminal justice in 2014 with the then Minister for Prisons, from which the pioneering Autism Accreditation Scheme arose. The first autism accredited prison was Her Majesty's Youth Offenders in the Institute of Feltham in 2016. The standards for accreditation apply to education, health and mental health services in prisons and cover autism understanding, training for staff, adjustments to the prison building such as reducing stimulation of posters and notices, changes to prison routines and individual risk assessments. This was developed by the National Autistic Society, which is now working with other prisons in the country towards accreditation. As of April 2017, pilots of accreditation programmes were also being trialled in the probation services, which I was very pleased to hear. This is undoubtedly progress, not only in terms of the implementation of the practical steps needed to become accredited, but in the accompanying cultural change towards greater awareness of autistic people's needs overall, and therefore the perception of autistic people themselves of not only greater understanding but greater acceptance of who they are. In the meantime, adequate and autism-specific training must be made available for all prison staff, as with the police. It's clear that much more research needs to be done in this field. More awareness needs to be raised across the board about what differences in the human experience exist for adults with autism, and crucially, that these differences are not experienced uniformly. It is clear that inroads are being made, but not quickly enough for those adults with autism who are being let down by our criminal justice system at present. And I urge the Minister to bring about change. Prison is at this time, in all circumstances, an inhuman setting, but for adults with autism, the situation is far, far more severe. And their route to getting there often brings severe distress. So societal change in attitudes through awareness and a concerted effort by the justice system to bring about change are, I believe, the key to generating a lasting improvement in autistic adults' experience of criminal justice. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Edward. It is a pleasure to speak for the first time under your chairmanship. Sir Edward, I came to the subject of autism rather late in life, and I would just share with members here a tale of visiting a primary school, a very remote primary school in Caithness, a number of years ago. And there was a boy, probably aged about 12, who was deeply engrossed in making an Airfix Halifax bomber. And I, anxious to impress him, said, that bomb is a Halifax. It has Merlin engines. Subtext was, aren't I clever to know that? The boy looked at me and said, yes, it's a Merlin Mark 20, but signified XX, with Stanley Hooker superchargers and brake horsepower of 1,240. And as my jaw sagged, the teacher murmured in my ear, and you all know what I'm going to say, Sir Edward, Asperger's. And that was the first time, despite, being in my 40s, that I had come across this. And then, and I shall return to this, that's partly the reason I'm here today for this debate, is because it's a learning process. And members, I'm sure members will recall the book, I think it was published in 2004, called The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. Now, medical professionals and experts in autism might say that's not an accurate depiction of autism, but from the inside of the person looking outwards, I think it was very, very instructive to all of us, and I was very glad to see that book became a really, really big seller. So I think it's about awareness of the issue. That's what this debate is about, and it's about all that's been mentioned so far. I didn't know what the word stimming meant until I got into the subject. I now know. And I can remember being in a bus myself, Sir Edward, and being irritated by somebody doing exactly that. And now that I look back, I feel ashamed of myself. I should have understood what the issue was. And the Marcus Potter story was a scary one as far as I was concerned. It turned out right in the end, but it just shows you how close we are sometimes to things going wrong. But that judge did a very, very good thing. And just to comment on 2 points that have been made by previous speakers, the Honourable Member of Berwick-on-Tweed, who is no longer with us, makes a good point when she suggests the idea of a link person in government departments, because that would go, it wouldn't cost particularly anything, but it would go a long way to, it's a very hackneyed expression, but to a joined-up approach to sorting this out. And the Honourable Member for East Kilbride, quite correctly, Sir Edward, made an intervention to point out that that Police Scotland are really quite up to speed with this. Now, I'm not always known for heaping praise on the Scottish Government, but I cannot fault them on this at all. They really have, and it's an issue that's difficult for some people, but they've not ducked it. I'm not saying our UK government is ducking it either at all. That's not my intention. So I wouldn't try to paint them into that corner. And my final point is this. Yes, I'll give it, certainly.
Thank you for giving way and for making some very pertinent points. The Northern Ireland Assembly, through the Autism Northern Ireland Act of 2014, had taken great strides in implementing an autism strategy, including the production of a guide for criminal justice professionals and the piloting of a registered intermediary scheme. So would the member not agree that when it comes to good practice, and the Minister is listening, and we have good practice in Northern Ireland, or good practice in Scotland, or good practice in Wales, that good practice could be used for the benefit of all the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and he should look towards the Northern Ireland Assembly and their autism strategy as one example of how we could all do things better.
Yes. Sir Edward, I have no problem with that intervention whatsoever. To conclude, that school that I visited in Caithness, to see the care that was lavished on this pupil was inspirational. Those teachers looked after him properly, and that's the way it should be done. It was a very splendid example of best practice. And finally, Sir Edward, this, I have slipping out of the habit now of not getting away any longer with saying as a new member, because I've been here for 7 months. And it's wearing a bit thin, Sir Edward, I do realise that. But I don't like too many here's to that. What I would say is that this idea of the Westminster debate, which you can go to, listen to, and learn things from, I think is a great strength of this place, because I will leave in a while this debate a wiser person. And that's good for me, and frankly, in terms of representation of the people, it's good for my constituents, our constituents. So I absolutely applaud the member for Cardiff West for bringing this debate towards today. Well done, well said. Angela Crawley.
Thank you, Sir Edward. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I would like to thank the Honourable Member for Cardiff West on securing this debate, and to the members who have brought forward and brought to the attention of this House the issues that their constituents face, in particular those with autism within the criminal justice system. Now, I would like to, of course, address the matter of autism, because it is, of course, a wide and variable spectrum, and I think it's important not to simply overgeneralise or overstate. The experience of each individual is different within the criminal justice system, and those with autism are no exception to that. But it is true that autistic people are more likely to be victims and witnesses of crime than offenders. They experience difficulties with social communication, social interaction and social imagination, and may have sensory difficulties and some coordination problems. Their behaviour may present differently and sometimes draw unnecessary attention, but general autism is a hidden disability and is not, or it may not be immediately obvious to someone or to other people that the person has a disability. Dealing with the criminal justice system in any capacity is therefore much harder with a person with autism. Now, to sum up some of the contributions made today, I think the Honourable Member for Cardiff West has outdone himself, and I commend the Honourable Member for giving a voice to his constituents' experience and advocating for much-needed changes to the criminal justice system. The Honourable Member for St Helens and Whiston, of course, identified the rise in hate crime, particularly of those who have a disability, and the sensitivity and need to train and support people differently who work in that environment, and the Honourable Member for Berwickshire, Roxburgh and Selkirk, who identified failures in process across the criminal justice system, both in Scotland and in the UK. I think the Honourable Member for Strangford, as always, raises a very valuable point about the need to share best practice and, of course, to look towards the autism strategies featured in Scotland and in Northern Ireland, because the early recognition, identification and training of those professionals who work in these sectors can only enhance the experience of those who have to undergo the treatment of the criminal justice system who are suffering from autism. Now, as mentioned earlier, the Scottish Government did publish a Scottish strategy for autism in 2011, and since then that consultation ran from the strategy contains 26 recommendations, including 4 under the overarching themes of developing multi-agency working. The consultation ran from 18th of October 2017 to 29th of November 2017 to refresh that 2011 strategy, and I think that was much needed, of course. This proposed the inclusion of a provision to consult with bodies, including the criminal justice system, and to improve on how people with autism are met within these services, something that I think can be learned across all parts of the UK, and I hope that the Minister will take that on board. However, the pace of change within the criminal justice system, as I'm sure he will agree, is not fast enough given the medical understanding and the variability of the understanding of autism. The National Autistic Society goes as far to say that the criminal justice system is failing those with autism, and it calls for that to be urgently addressed. Now, Sir Edward, there are many aspects of the criminal justice system that are worthy of review, and I hope that the treatment of adults with autism will be given the same consideration in this debate. Thank you.
Caroline Harris.
Sir Edward, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'd like to congratulate my honourable friend for, my honourable friend for Cardiff West for securing this important debate. Let's be very clear, autistic people are discriminated against in society as a whole, but especially in the criminal justice system. They can face discrimination when their autism is not readily apparent or no help is offered, and where it is apparent, they are often treated differently or suspiciously. Autistic people without a learning disability are 9 times more likely to die by suicide than the rest of the population. This figure is considerably high and shows the lack of understanding and awareness of the needs of people with autism. On occasions when an autistic person comes to the attention of the police and other services, it is normally a result of their social and communication difficulties being misunderstood or because they have not been given appropriate support. Autistic people can become extremely distressed in situations that they do not understand or when they are surrounded by noise and confusion. And in such circumstances, their actions and behaviour can easily be misinterpreted, and subsequent actions may escalate a situation. The criminal justice system needs to reform and adapt in order to meet its fundamental human rights obligation to treat people fairly and equitably. The National Autistic Society developed its autism accreditation scheme to work in prison settings. Accreditation covers autism understanding training for prison staff such as guards, but is also more widely helping make the prison environment more autism friendly. But accreditation should be extended to all prisons, all detention centres, all courts and all police stations, as well as the probation service. The duty must be on the prison and courts and their individual officers to ensure the fair treatment of those in contact with the criminal justice system. Individual officers could also be accredited. there should be a requirement for at least one key individual in central functions to be accredited. For example, duty sergeants or clerks of courts. Accreditation recognises good practice, which helps ensure that people on the autistic spectrum get the extra support needed to adjust to life in prison, extra support while they serve a sentence or as they prepare for leaving prison. Without this support, autistic people may develop additional needs, such as mental health problems or risky behaviour, and rehabilitation will be harder. Greater awareness and support will be of benefit to autistic people, as well as prison staff, police officers and managers in that area of work. Expert opinion is clear that autism sufferers need special and sensitive treatment, especially in a stressful criminal justice environment. I certainly will.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend and thank her for the way she's responding to the debate. And what she just said triggered off a thought that I had. This is a quote from Professional Standards Department of the Police Service commenting on the complaint that my constituents made. And it says as follows: "I've read this several times and they just don't get it, do they? They continue to maintain that their son should have been diverted prior to arrest. What utter rubbish." And if that is the continuing attitude within the police, does she agree that we've got a long way to go to get this right?
We certainly have got a long way to go. And what my honourable friends have said just epitomises what we all know, that we do need to look at autism as a special consideration. Because for many autistic people in prison has meant the system has failed. Work must be done with probation services and with police forces to create a specification for autism accreditation in that setting. This will help prevent autistic adults from entering the criminal justice system in the first place, and it will certainly help with rehabilitation. More training and support must be given to initial responders to crime, those working with witnesses and victims. Initial contact with the police will often come at a time of heightened anxiety, so it is really important that the police know how to approach such a situation and how not to allow it to escalate. I certainly will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way on that point. And would she agree with me that training for police officers in this situation would actually help them to prevent further either reoffending or also re-victimisation? And I think that's something which our colleagues in the police share with us, that aim of wanting to reduce reoffending and re-victimisation.
That's certainly the experience that I've had talking to police officers, that they would appreciate training to better understand the condition and the way that they deal with autistic offenders. This understanding is vital throughout the criminal justice system. So if we are to regard people with autism in a fair and equal way, we must look at how we provide for their needs. And I'm sure the Minister has listened to the very wise words of many colleagues today, and I'm sure he will offer us some hope that the government will look at this issue and treat it with some urgency.
Minister.
Sir Edward, a great pleasure to serve again under your chairmanship. And may I start by offering my sincere congratulations to the Honourable Member for Labour Cardiff West, not just for securing the debate, but the way in which he presented the subject. I had the great pleasure of shadowing him for the period that he adorned the last Labour government as Minister for the third sector, and the sincerity and thoughtfulness with which he has approached this sensitive subject today is entirely characteristic of him. And I must say, I must also congratulate other members who've contributed to this debate. I'm entirely with the relatively new member for Caithness, Sutherland and East Ross. I've sat through enough rubbish debates in this place to know a good one, and the good ones are where you leave learning something. And I'll be very frank, the subject on which I'm asked to speak today is not one on which I have a deeply rooted, strong understanding of it, and I will leave this place better informed, and a good debate should also be a catalyst for some action and some further probing from ministers. I know ministers are trained to try and exude and diffuse an aura of all-knowingness. The honourable member knows that is a total fallacy. And in this case, as I hope in my remarks, I will try and give him some reassurance, and other colleagues who've spoken, that there's a recognition of one very big central point, which is that despite the undeniable progress we have made as a country, as a society, as a parliament, since I joined in 2005, in terms of our understanding and awareness, that central word of autism, and the needs and the consequences of what the Honourable Member for Huddersfield described as an often hostile environment. Despite the progress that we undeniably have met, this debate makes very clear, not just from the individual anecdotes, but from the voices from all parts of the United Kingdom, and the Honourable Member for Roxburgh very clear in his view that there's still a lot more to be done in Scotland as elsewhere. But we've heard from all parts of the United Kingdom in this debate, and that's a powerful message around the fact that despite the progress we made, there is still insufficient awareness and understanding, and that can sometimes lead to unreasonable judgments and decisions that in turn can lead to trauma and extremely traumatic experience, not just for the individuals involved, but also for their family. As the Honourable Member for Labour Cardiff West came here, and he respected the desire for anonymity, but clearly this debate springs from his own experience in trying to serve a constituent. So let me start with that acknowledgement, which I think everyone agrees there's clearly some way to go. Now, again, the Honourable Gentleman for Cardiff West, drawing on his experience as a minister, was clear that a number of different ministers could have stood up here and represented the government at this point. It was his fate to get the Home Office. And so inevitably what I will say will focus primarily on that first point of contact inside the criminal justice system. But again, I give my undertaking to him and to others that based on what I've heard, I will speak directly to the new Minister for Prisons to test his understanding and appetite to follow up on some of the specific requests in this debate, not least the desire to encourage other prisoners to follow the example of the prison in my honourable friend, the member for Roxburgh's constituency, and continue down the path of accreditation. So I give him that undertaking. But when it comes to the police, again, I think we again need to start by recognising that autism is believed to affect around 1% of the population. That makes it highly likely that police officers will encounter people with autism in the course of their duties. Now, and it wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment on the specifics of the case that the Honourable Member for Cardiff West has raised, but it's quite clear from his account and the fact that charges were dropped that mistakes were made in that process, and that the experience has had a profound effect on the individual and the family. And I'm sure the whole House and colleagues would want to associate themselves with the regret expressed for that outcome. But I hope he will acknowledge, as a general point, not relating to the specific, that our police officers are often called on to make decisions in difficult circumstances. They have a very difficult job, and they have to make decisions in difficult circumstances, and often have to act swiftly to protect individuals or the public more generally. He knows that. We all know that. And they also have a duty to investigate alleged offences, especially where there are alleged victims. Given the nature of autism, brilliantly articulated in this debate, it is also possible that at times the actions of some individuals with this condition may be mistaken for uncooperative or even aggressive behaviour. Again, I'm not inferring this was necessarily the case in the specific instance the Honourable Member referred to, but it's clearly a risk, and it clearly happens. I will certainly give way, yeah.
all on a learning curve today, and in the midst of time, I was Boy Haddison's deputy as a shadow minister in charge of police and prisons. So we all have a learning curve here. But would you agree, the real change we've had in very recent years, for all sorts of reasons, is a great improvement in the way children's services, running across all the services, have to get more joined up. And as my honourable friend said, for children, we've got much better. It's when we get to adults that we seem to have so much difficulty.
Well, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his intervention, and I think he makes a reasonable point. I do think we've made considerable progress, and I think the Honourable Gentleman for Cardiff West was at pains to point out at the beginning of his remarks that he wanted to focus on adults, because that's where clearly some stubborn and significant problems still continue to reside in terms of awareness, understanding, decisions, judgments, and treatments. And it's clear that we cannot be complacent about that. And I hope I can reassure the House we will take all possible steps to improve general understanding and responses that are appropriate within the criminal justice agencies. The Honourable Gentleman pressed me on training, and I'd like to speak a little to that. The Honourable Gentleman is no doubt aware the Government has published a national strategy on autism. I think autism, in fact, I think referred to it. This was refreshed in January 2016, and it does set out a programme of work across government sectors to improve preventative action and support to those living with autism, to assist them to lead fulfilling and independent lives wherever possible. It also included recommendations for further improvements in the services and support available across health, education, employment and criminal justice sectors. As part of this, the College of Policing, he cited cuts to police. The College of Policing budget has not been cut because there is a strong commitment to training and development of police officers. They committed to developing a new module of the authorised professional practice for the police service. This was included in revised guidance on mental health and vulnerability guidance published in October 2016. And this is the primary reference source for police on legal obligations and the appropriate response to incidents involving people with mental ill health, autism, learning disabilities and other vulnerabilities. It provides indicators for police staff as to when there may be health or mental health issues underlying apparent behaviour, and this should lead to better and more appropriate decision-making. The guidance is backed by training modules for all staff who may come into contact with vulnerable people. In addition, the National Autistic Society, and I join others in congratulating them on their work, as I also congratulate the APGG and the Westminster Commission. The National Autistic Society has published a national guide for police officers and staff, which has been distributed to all forces. And in many areas, there is close liaison between police forces and local autism support groups. But again, I give this undertaking to the Honourable Gentleman. The College of Policing, which is the agency we do rely on for the development of police standards and training, is under new leadership, Mike Cunningham. And I undertake to him to write to Mike following this debate to set out some of the concerns expressed in this debate, to seek reassurance back from the college that they are understood, absorbed, and to seek reassurance back that the college attributes a sufficient amount of weight and importance to this issue. Yes, sir.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way, and I'm very pleased to hear this commitment about encouraging the National College of Policing with their training. Would he be willing to consider making the very clear point to the college and to police officers, we respect what they do, we know how hard their job is, and that this is actually not about special pleading for a particular group. It's actually about making sure that there is genuine access to justice, and that does mean that some people will need different treatment to achieve an equal outcome. And in order for people with autism to be treated equally and fairly within the criminal justice system, that may sometimes, not always, mean different treatment. And that has to come from better awareness. I think better awareness can only improve police responses. And like I said, I genuinely believe the police want to reduce unnecessary reoffending and re-victimisation. Will he make that commitment?
Well, I agree with the Honourable Leader. My experience of talking to police officers at university they want to do the job properly. They do a very difficult job. They need the tools to help them in that job. And the fundamental challenge we've got is the challenge expressed in this debate, which is still that levels of awareness and understanding are too low. And it's our responsibility to help the police officers do what comes natural to them, which is to try and do their job properly, safeguard the vulnerable where they can, but play their part in executing swift justice as well. It's quite clear that the process of education, understanding, awareness building has to continue, doesn't end really, and that's why I've undertaken to seek reassurances from new leadership at the college that they understand that. The police and other agencies are continuing to explore innovative solutions to help support those in the community with autism with daily interactions or official contact. In some areas, autism alert cards are available to be carried by those who are autistic. Locally developed systems may also include information about the person and contact details of family members or other carers. In other areas, similar results are achieved through autism apps held on mobile telephones, which can include information such as carer details and the user's coping mechanisms, as well as useful links to external support sites. So technology can be our friend here, but there is no substitute for the training guidance that we talked about. I'd like to say a word about police detention, Sir Edward, because that is has been a difficult and emotive subject. If the police encounter a person who appears to be mentally disordered and to be in immediate need of care and control, it is open to them to exercise powers under the Mental Health Act, Section 136, to take such a person to a place of safety for a mental health assessment. Such powers might be appropriate in the case of a person with autism, depending on the individual circumstances, and might be the preferred course to an arrest, again, depending on precise circumstances. New legislative provisions, however, provide that where it is practicable to do so, police officers should consult a mental health professional before exercising such powers. This is intended to ensure that the most appropriate decisions are made in each case, particularly where the person may already be in contact with local health or social support services. However, if an offence is alleged to have been committed or the person needs to be dealt with through the criminal justice system, notwithstanding any underlying health factors, an arrest may be necessary and appropriate. Under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, codes do set out the safeguards that need to be in place in respect of any individual in custody, with particular provisions in respect of the most vulnerable. Forces are expected to have available, easy-read documents using simple language and pictures to show what will happen while they are in custody. The Honourable Gentleman Cardiff West talked about the need for appropriate adults in situations where that may not have been in place. We are quite clear that an appropriate adult is required to be present in cases involving children or vulnerable adults, including those with autism, during procedures such as being given information on rights, detention reviews, interviews and taking of any evidence. He pressed me quite rightly about the government's response to the Lord Bradley report. Can I assure him that we have taken very seriously that report, and there's a programme of action on its various recommendations. In terms of liaison and diversion schemes, he may be aware that these now operate in police stations and courts across some 80% of England, and work continues on how best to ensure that appropriate adults are available when required. A working group of the PACE Strategy Board has been developing an approach to improving provision across the country. This involves partnership work between PCCs and local authorities, and it is expected to be completed and published soon. Yes.
This is coming to a very sensitive part of his speech, and I'm sure he's going to turn to the international dimension. Has he any update for us in terms of the Lowry Love case, where we still are fighting, many of us in Parliament, fighting to save that young man from being taken to the United States in a hostile environment where he might well commit suicide? Has he any update for this in this debate?
The short answer is no. I'm not in a position to give an update to the House on that, but I do, of course, completely understand the sensitivity around it, and an announcement will be made in due course. What I was trying to give reassurance to the honourable member who has prompted this debate was around measures taken to ensure greater provision of appropriate adults. And I was saying that liaison and diversion schemes do operate in police stations and court across some 80% of England now, and these can help to assess individual vulnerabilities and any underlying mental health, autism or learning disabilities issues. They can further assist with referring the person to an appropriate health or welfare assessment if necessary, as well as helping to inform the most appropriate charging decision or sentencing outcome. The honourable gentleman in his speech mentioned the frustration of the family in his constituency case with the complaints procedure. So let me say something briefly about that. If individuals are unhappy about their treatment by the police, there are avenues of complaint. Individuals may complain directly to the relevant police force. They can also raise a matter with their local police and crime commissioner. Complaints that include serious and sensitive matters such as assault or serious corruption must be referred directly by the police to the IOPC. Police and crime commissioners maintain an overview of complaints about the police, and they are democratically elected to hold the Chief Constable to account for the performance of the force on behalf of the public. There is a further right to appeal against the way a complaint has been handled by the police. Depending on the nature of the complaint, this will be either to the Chief Constable or to the Independent Office for Police Conduct, formerly the Independent Police Complaints Commission. Someone wanted to give yes, yeah.
Just on that point of accountability, and I know it isn't directly his responsibility at the Home Office, but there seems to be there is a gap in that accountability chain in relation to the British Transport Police, as it's paid for by the train operating companies and doesn't have an elected police and crime commissioner. Would he undertake to take that away and talk with some of his ministerial colleagues about whether or not there are ways we could improve accountability in relation to the British Transport Police?
I think he does make a reasonable point of that, and I can certainly give him that undertaking and undertake to communicate back to him the consequences of that undertaking. The point I also wanted to make to him in the context of the complaints process around the police, this is a very sensitive area, both for the public and for the police themselves. The IOPC, as it is now called, formerly the IPCC, again is under new leadership, a new Chief Executive, Michael Lockwood, and again I undertake to write to Michael following this debate to register some of the concerns expressed in this debate so that this is on his radar screen as he assumes leadership of that organisation at this time. In conclusion, Sir Edward, I do congratulate the honourable gentleman for securing a debate that has allowed me to raise my own awareness of some of the difficulties underlying and some of the experiences that our fellow citizens are experiencing, which are quite unacceptable in terms of the treatment they receive within our public services, whether the criminal justice system or the health system. And this remains a challenge for us as a society and governments of all colours. What I hope I've tried to reassure colleagues is that we have done much in recent years to improve awareness of and understanding about people with what may be initially invisible vulnerabilities such as autism, but clearly there doubtless remains much more that can be done, and this government has, I believe, demonstrated its commitment to improving protections for the well-being of the potentially vulnerable, including in the criminal justice system. I've given various undertakings in this debate, which I will honour, despite whatever advice I receive after the debate. I congratulate everyone who's contributed to this debate, because debates such as this one will ensure that this issue remains high on the agenda. And I've seen it rise since I've been here in Parliament, but it is only through the persistence of APPG and members and various commissions in the National Autistic Society that this point continues to be pressed, that more members come out of these debates with their awareness raised of the importance of this issue. Thank you.
I'm grateful, Edward, just for a brief opportunity to respond as there is time, and to thank everyone who's participated in the debate this afternoon. And more than one member has pointed out that it's been a learning curve for everyone present, and I would include myself amongst those numbers. I think it's continually a subject on which we all can learn more and will benefit from learning more in relation to autism And I particularly thank all honourable colleagues who've participated either by making a speech or an intervention, and I hope as many as possible attend my honourable friend, the member for Bristol West's debate tomorrow, I believe, also on another aspect of autism, which I think reinforces the point I made at the outset of the debate, that this is a subject which permeates across different parts of government and therefore highlights the need for ministers to do what the minister has promised to do, and that is to work with each other and perhaps to consider some of the suggestions made during the course of debate for perhaps a more formal way of working with each other to tackle the issue of autism across all government departments. And if he chooses to do that along with his colleagues, he'll certainly have my support, and I'm sure of other honourable friends on this side of the House. Can I thank the Minister for the way that he's responded to the debate? He referred to the brief period when I was radiant with lawful power all those years ago, and when he was my shadow. I'm now a shadow of my former self in this context. But what I do know of him in relation to his remarks at the end of the debate is that, and I heard his officials' ears prick up when he said this, that he was going to carry out what he'd promised to do during the course of the debate, whatever advice he received. I should say to his officials, I know that he is a free-range organic minister rather than a battery-farmed one, and therefore is never satisfied to just read out his brief from his civil servants, but will actually listen and try to act. And having lavished praise on him, he now has to fulfil all of the things he pledged to do during the course of the debate, which was to follow up with other ministers to make sure that he got the College of Policing on the case in relation to this, and to also take on board the point I was making about the British Transport Police and the IOPC, and I'm glad he's going to engage with the new leadership at the new IOPC in relation to this. And I do actually absolutely concur with him in relation to some of the great work that our police officers do in very difficult circumstances. But there are occasions where, either through lack of training or in some cases through poor practice, that things go wrong, and we are here to hold them to account whilst acknowledging the incredible work they do under the most difficult of circumstances. So I thank the Minister for the sincerity with which he's responded to the debate and his promises that he will take things further and learn more about all of this. And I'd like to finally thank all of the families and parents and people with autism across the country for their tremendous forbearance under very difficult circumstances, sometimes also for the way that they cope with what can be a very difficult situation from time to time during the courses of their lives, and hope that today's debate will genuinely help move things forward and make a difference.
Questions this House has considered the treatment of adults with autism by the criminal justice system. As many of that opinion say aye, the contrary no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Order, order. Thank you. Thank you. Sitting suspended until 4 o'clock. Thank you.